And thanks to you for lingering to the bitter end here. The good news is that I think I can. Yeah, that's right. I think I can make it under 10 minutes, 12 minutes. But then the accent comes out because I have to speak fast and it will not be pretty.
Well.
We're also interested in the question of attribution of responsibility. This is a paper that my colleague Nathan and myself, along with the student of ours, Adriana Crespo, are trying to put together. We are interested in the question of attribution of responsibility, but contrary to the topic of the conference today, we really are looking at past banking crises as opposed to the most recent one. And we are looking at the country level as opposed to the individual level, as Tim was mentioning. We are focusing on banking crises as opposed to other sources of economic performance because we believe this is advantageous. These are, after all, events that are extremely visible and salient. They, mostly because they usually come with huge direct fiscal costs and indirect economic costs as well in terms of lower economic growth. They also generally raise issues of fairness that are important to voters. Also, despite presumably having different causes, these really are events that we consider to be relatively comparable. We're talking about instances of insolvency in vast swaths of the banking systems of different countries. We would love to make the case that these events sort of happen out of the blue sky and are sort of random. We know that that's not really true, and it's especially not true given the indicator that we use to count when these banking crises have happened in the past. But as I think Brad was making the point, they are also not that easy to predict, right? So there is a component of uncertainty that we try to take an advantage of. The argument that we have is a relatively simple one. We want to figure out, first of all, if banking crises affect income and survival. That's something that we have a sense of. There are a couple of papers in that regard, one by Trevor and Walter, that basically uncover that there is this correlation. But we also want to use this as an opportunity to test some clarity of responsibility theses that are out there. And we believe that looking at banking crisis will give us that opportunity. In terms of expectations, we certainly have an unmediated effect of banking crisis expectation. That is, we expect that banking crisis will have a negative impact on the survival of incumbents in both authoritarian and democratic regimes. Here is where a little bit of the hand waving starts. When it comes to democratic regimes, the mechanism that we have in mind is one where voters, citizens are capable of attributing the banking crisis to the government at hand and then come out and vote against them. When it comes to authoritarian regimes, that's less clear. Where sort of our operating understanding is that it is mostly, the coalition that supports the authoritarian clique or the authoritarian leaders that suffers the banking crisis, and also they have an incentive to make this known to the authoritarian leader, sometimes in not very nice ways. When it comes to clarity of responsibility, we're looking here at some of the theses that you guys are aware of, and people in the room have contributed to this. In particular, for the first one, we're basically following the power of written clarity of responsibility original argument. We're going to make the case that here it is not variation at the level of individuals, but variation in institutional travel of countries that lead us to expect that where you have a larger set of veto players, attribution of responsibility for banking crisis may be more difficult to make. And when it comes to international sources of clarity of responsibility, we're basically going to be following the lead of people like Eric and Tim here, and we are going to believe what you say, and we're going to try to figure out if open economies end up diluting the possibility of attributing responsibility to incumbent governments after banking crisis. As I mentioned before, the question of whether these really are events that happen exogenously is difficult to answer in the affirmative, because what we're considering as our main independent variable is this set that was put together by Leiden and Valencia recently. What they do is that they look at the year of onset of a banking crisis. This follows actually a relatively long tradition. It comes from the mid-1990s. People like Gerard Caprio and Daniela Quintero had been putting together these sets, and their work was based on previous collections as well. And the problem with this measure is that in order to figure out that the banking crisis has occurred in a particular country Y at year T, they sometimes require to look into measures of policy output. So for example, if they detect that there has been a bank holiday that comes out of the blue, well, that's mostly because governments are aware that there will be a roam the banks and they close them for a while. If they detect that there's been some extension of deposit guarantees, that's against certain purpose. So it is always part of the way in which we detect banking crises has to do already with ways in which governments are responding to them, and this is a problem. Here you see the red count corresponds to systemic banking crises. Catherine Guilermo basically identified 130 banking crises in 161 countries between 1971 and 2009. You have a few less here because we start in 1976. The data that we are going to be considering provides for a smaller time frame, shorter time frame. We're looking at country years from 1975 to 2005. So this really leaves out most of the most recent action in Europe and the United States. Our interest originally was with the life stories of individual leaders. And our starting point was the literature on war and survival that seems to occupy a large niche in international relations. And so we were building on data put together by Hein Homans, the Archegos data set. Unfortunately, though our interest is in leaders, and at that level of analysis we really have very fine-grained information, once we move up and we combine this with a banking crisis data set, we really are forced then to move to the country year level. And that ends up introducing some problems that we are not that sure about how to deal with. Let me also say that the way in which we've seen these data being put to use has left us a little bit confused and flustered, and we are not sure how to solve our confusion. The problem that we see is that in an effort to compare the survival of leaders across what are in fact very different types of regimes, not only authoritarian versus democratic, but within democratic regimes, presidential and parliamentary regimes, they basically look at the actual length of the time in office that the leader has. The problem that we see there is that for presidential regimes particularly, well, these usually are ex-ante known times, and it doesn't really make much sense to consider them as spells of uncertain duration. So what we've done, we believe that this helps us walk away from that problem, and in doing that, unfortunately, we're introducing perhaps some others, but what we've done is that we've considered a party membership of the president, the executive in presidential regimes, the largest member of a coalition in parliamentary regimes, and when it comes to authoritarian regimes, we actually look at this basically ends up being a measure of how long the authoritarian regime lasts. So unless there are obvious changes within the governing coalition within an authoritarian regime, we end up having very long spells for authoritarian regimes. This is our attempt at trying to get away from this certainty of death that is not really considered as certain in the war and survival studies. So our unit of analysis is going to be the duration of what we call incumbent spells. These incumbent spells are basically the amount of time that a party stays in power, or party is defined as I just mentioned now. We have 676 incumbent spells among the many countries that we have in our data set. And out of these, about the third, 120, are eventful spells, meaning that these were spells during which at least one banking crisis occurred. So these are the ones that we will be interested in. Let me just take 1 minute to explain how our coding decisions work and what we lose and what we gain in doing so. Argentina is a fantastic place to study this kind of arrangements, mostly because it has it all. Right? It was an authoritarian regime up to 1982. This is the military that lost the Malvinas Falklands War. Then you have a process, a very rapid process transition to democracy. You have a government of the right, the Unión Cívica Radical, governing until 1991. Then Menem comes in power. There's a period of relative stability under the Peronist Party, followed again by a brief interlude of the Unión Cívica Radical and another splinter party of the Peronists that ended up overseeing, the toughest part of the 2001 crisis in that particular country. So what we do here, following that crisis, if you recall, this is the period in which it seemed that every week there was a new Argentine president, there was a lot of turmoil politically. What we've done here, what we lose, is that, for example, towards the tail end of the distribution here, we consider all of these guys to be Peronists, and therefore we consider the Peronists to still be the incumbent party in government. We also, as we move from the very detailed life stories that we get from the Archegos set, so for example, Alfonsín here gets the blame for these banking crises. The red lines are the banking crises that Argentina has suffered 90s and early 2000s. When we moved to the party level, because we don't really have the ability of dating precisely the banking crisis, that ends up being attributed to a different government. What's that? No, I actually got it right here. So that's not a problem for this particular slide. But in general, we will have these measurement errors that, for borderline cases, we might be missing some of them, and this is something we need to start looking with more care into. A rather interesting thing is that if you look at the marginal distribution of the duration of spells, well, you actually look at the conditional distribution conditional on whether the spell had a banking crisis or not. It turns out that spells with banking crisis tend to be longer. Now, that's counterintuitive. The fact is that goes away once you consider that many banking crises occur in authoritarian countries that are also relatively poor. So these, by virtue of their characteristics, tend also to have authoritarian governments that linger for a long while. So we are aware that there are several controls that we need to bring into our models. We will control for these two very basic characteristics: the type of regime that the country is in, and the level of economic development. When it comes to democracies, however, there doesn't seem to be too much of a difference between spells where you observe a crisis and spells where you don't observe a crisis. And part of the problem here is that we don't really know, and we can't tell from this kind of disaggregation of the data, where exactly, at what point in time in the incumbent spell the banking crisis falls. So in an effort to get at that, we've been experimenting with some duration models. I will be even more candid than I usually am about presenting the data, just because it's the first time that I work with this kind of specifications. So if you see any glaring anomalies or mistakes, this is the time where you can help us and prevent future embarrassment for us. Our dependent variable is the duration of incumbent spells, as I mentioned before. We are relying on a Cox proportional hazards specification, as they seem to be doing in the war and survival literature. What we do is that we include also random intercept at the country level. These are the so-called shared phrases in these models. So basically, we're trying to capture other potential characteristics at the country level that might systematically determine that some spells are longer or shorter there. And as covariates, I already talked about our bank crisis covariate. This is a time-varying covariate in a sense. What we do is that as of the year of bank crisis onset, we start giving ones to the rest of the spell of the incumbent. So we have zeros before the banking crisis, ones afterwards. For our clarity of responsibility hypothesis, in order to test the Powell-Witten idea about how difficult it might be to find whom to blame for a crisis, we're basically using so far a measure of Beetle points. This is Hennis's measure of Beetle points. So just how many political players, one needs to convince in order to pass a particular policy. For our international dimension here, for the argument that openness may dilute responsibility, we're basically looking at measures of trade and capital openness. And we are looking at the measure of global crisis. This is basically any crisis that started 1981, 1982, and 1983, or any crisis that started in 1997, 98, or 99, following Reinhardt's and Rogoff's new book. We simply assume that these were global crises. So the idea here is that if the crisis is really global, citizens might not blame their governments directly, and as a consequence, you might end up seeing longer spells for these particular periods. Let me skip the graphs here and just give you a sense of our predictions. What you see here are survival times. So these are the proportion of spells that survive starting at year one, right? So year one, you have 100% of the spells as survivors. Towards the end of the graph, in some cases, we're looking at dictatorships that last a long while, and that's why you see these going into the 50s. Not only that, but actually there are also democratic regimes where you have the same party in power for a long while, right? Think about Japan, think about places like that. First of all, our own mediated hypothesis here very rapidly seems to be borne out in that both autocracies and democracies, both authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes, seem to suffer or to last less when they have a banking crisis than when they don't have a banking crisis, right? That's a very basic result that serves us as a check, just to make sure that this is indeed something that's worth looking at. More interestingly, these are the same kind of graphs. This will be a little bit confusing because I also try to present you with confidence intervals, and I should have gone with colors. I now get that. But you know that the line for both the thick lines and the thin lines, the line in the middle is the actual point prediction. The lines are the other, the lines in the bounds represent 95% confidence intervals. When you look at spells where there is no banking crisis, it doesn't seem to matter much whether this is an open economy or a closed economy. You know, they are basically overlapping. All of the other predictors in our models are held at median values. Here you are looking at an open economy is defined as one that has values in the 75th percentile of the sample for both trade openness and capital openness. So it's those two things together. And the closed economy has values in the 25th percentile of the sample for both of those variables. When it comes to spells that do have a banking crisis, despite the fact that there is a bit of an overlap in the confidence intervals, here you start seeing that there is much more of a difference. Right? Open economies in general have spells, incumbent spells, that are longer than spells in closed economies when you compare spells that have crises.
This is also a clarificating question. So the percentiles are of the whole sample, not of the time period they're in, because I assume openness is increased at
right.
aggregate level across.
And that's a disclaimer that I have. When I look at this graph, I'm part of this happy, of course, but the fact is that I still have to go back and figure out what the distribution of data is. Because one concern that we have is that these results might be entirely model dependent. And that you only have a few points for closed economies without the banking crisis, and so on and so forth. So these are questions that I unfortunately can't answer yet, but these are very much important remarks. When it comes to survival of incumbent parties in democratic regimes, again, that's what we'll be looking at. When we look at veto points, we actually don't see much of a difference. I mean, the combination of coefficients and all that is seemingly one where we do see that countries with high vetoes survive mildly longer, but this effect is so substantively significant that I didn't even bother to draw confidence intervals here. We basically find no effect, which is not what we would have expected from our reading of the clarity responsibility history. I guess that's it. I promised it would be 10 minutes, and I ran over that. Well, basically, what we find out is that authoritarian regimes and government and democratic regimes do seem to die sooner when they confront banking crisis. Here, our counterfactuals are all of those other spells that did not suffer the banking crisis, and we're trying our best to bring in control covariates to make them more or less comparable. Among democratic regimes, we seem to find some support for the idea that open economies diminish the negative impact of banking crises, but we do not find correlations in the significant levels of statistical association for our hypothesis regarding veto points and the possible impact of global crises. Where we want to take this in the future, there are so many issues that we have to solve with the models and all that, or rather go over and make sure that we are not making attributions that have nothing to do with the data. What we want to do in future work, though, is we also want to start looking at the survival of authoritarian regimes. And these would mostly be questions of really regime change, transitions to democracy, because we are interested in seeing if these large shocks are of such a powerful magnitude that they might nudge countries, authoritarian countries, in the right direction. My experience here directly comes from Mexico, which is a country that suffered one of these in 94, 96, 94 to 95, and then 4 years later you do see that part of the build-up against how the government reacted to a particular crisis manifests itself in voting for an opposition party. And that's precisely the other direction that we hope to take at some point. We would like to understand whether government survival, incumbent survival, is in any way conditional on response or magnitude of the crisis. And here, unfortunately, the issues that we have to solve to really get a handle on what part of the government response to a crisis is already predetermined by the expected, by the magnitude of the shock, right? This is where I think we're going to have a lot of trouble, but that's anyway where we hope to move in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Guillermo. Unfortunately,